2,000 years ago, the most powerful empire in human history began to die. Not on a battlefield, not from a plague, not because of weak emperors or barbarian armies breaking through the gates. It began to die inside a room, a quiet room, where a group of wealthy private men sat around a table, made a deal with the Roman government, and walked away with the legal right to extract money from millions of ordinary people and profit from every single one of them. That deal has a name. It is called tax farming. And the reason you have never heard of it in any personal finance class, any economics lecture, or any mainstream conversation about money is because the same fundamental structure, private profit extracted from public obligation, is still operating today, in a different building. With a different name, but with identical logic. By the time this video ends, you will understand how Rome was financially hollowed out from the inside before a single barbarian crossed the border. And you will recognize with uncomfortable clarity exactly where that same hollow feeling exists in the modern financial system you live inside right now. Let's go back to the beginning, not the dramatic beginning with legions and conquests. The quiet beginning, the financial beginning. Rome had a problem that every large government eventually faces. It needed money, constantly, to fund armies, build roads, pay officials, maintain order across thousands of miles of territory. And collecting that money directly from millions of people across dozens of provinces was slow, complicated, and expensive. So Rome made a decision that seemed brilliant at the time. Instead of waiting for slow, difficult tax collection, the government would sell the right to collect taxes to private businessmen. In advance, here is exactly how it worked. A wealthy Roman businessman or a group of them working together would approach the state and make a bid. They would offer to pay Rome a guaranteed lump sum up front right now, immediately, in exchange for the legal right to go into a province and collect whatever taxes were owed there. The state got its money instantly. The businessman got a contract, and then he went to work. These men were called the Publicani. And on paper, they looked like efficient private contractors solving a government logistics problem. In practice, they were something else entirely. They were the first institutionalized extraction machine in Western financial history. Because here is what the Publicani did once they held that contract. They had already paid Rome. Every coin they collected above what they had paid was pure profit. Which means they had every possible financial incentive to collect as much as possible, by any means available. And they did. Farmers in the provinces who owed taxes suddenly found themselves facing men who were not government officials bound by state rules. They were private profit seekers with legal authority. And if a farmer could not pay the full amount immediately, the Publicani had a solution for that too. They would lend him the money, at interest, to pay the tax they were collecting, on behalf of a contract they had bought from the government that was supposed to serve the people. Read that again slowly. The tax collector was also the lender. The person who decided how much you owed was also the person who profited when you could not pay. The system that was supposed to fund public infrastructure had become a private debt machine. And if that arrangement sounds familiar, it should. Because the fundamental structure, a private entity profiting from public financial obligation, with the government receiving upfront cash while citizens inherit the risk, is not ancient history. It is the architecture of modern consumer debt. It is how payday lenders operate. It is how certain mortgage structures were designed before 2008. It is how credit card penalty systems work today. The building has changed. The logic has not moved an inch in 2,000 years. But what made the Roman system particularly devastating was not just the extraction. It was the trust destruction that followed it. Because when ordinary people in the provinces looked at the tax system and saw not a government serving them but a private businessman squeezing them for profit, something irreversible happened. They stopped believing the empire was working for them. And an empire that its own people stopped believing in has already begun to fall. The barbarians just finished the job. Now here is where the story gets even darker. Because Rome did not have just one financial problem. It had two, and the second one was happening simultaneously inside the treasury itself. Rome needed money not just from taxes but from the coins in circulation. And when the treasury felt pressure from wars, from instability, from the cost of keeping the empire intact, it found a solution that seemed clever in the short term. It began reducing the amount of silver in its coins. This is called currency debasement, and in the beginning it was barely noticeable. A coin that was once 90% silver became 80%, then 70%, then 50%. Then, by the 3rd century AD, some Roman coins contained less than 5% silver. They were essentially worthless metal with a Roman stamp on them. At first, nobody could tell. The coins looked the same, they felt the same, the emperor's face was still on the front. But over time, merchants started noticing that the coins they were receiving bought less than they used to. Prices started rising, trust started cracking, and people began doing something that always happens when official money stops being trustworthy. They started hoarding real silver, hoarding gold. And in some regions, abandoning coins entirely and returning to barter. Think about what that means for an empire. The entire Roman economic system was built on coins moving freely, paying soldiers, buying grain, funding construction, paying taxes. When people stop trusting the coins, the entire circulatory system of the economy begins to fail. It is exactly like blood clotting. The movement slows, then stops, then the body collapses. And here is the part that makes this story extraordinary and genuinely unsettling. These two disasters, predatory tax farming and currency debasement, were not separate problems happening independently. They were feeding each other in a vicious cycle that nobody at the top of the empire seemed able or willing to stop. When the Publicani drained the provinces, local economies weakened. Weakened local economies generated less natural tax revenue. Less revenue meant the treasury felt more pressure. More pressure meant the government debased the coins further to cover the gap. Debased coins meant rising prices. Rising prices meant ordinary people needed more coins to survive. More financial pressure on ordinary people meant more fell behind on taxes. More people behind on taxes meant the Publicani had more leverage. More leverage meant more debt, more extraction, more resentment, round and round, tightening every single turn for centuries. And the government's response to each crisis was the same response that makes the modern reader's blood run cold with recognition. More taxation, more pressure, harsher penalties for non-payment, weaker money to cover short-term gaps, emergency measures that solved nothing and worsened everything. Sound familiar? There is a term for what Rome was experiencing in its final centuries. Economists call it a debt deflation spiral trapped inside an inflationary monetary system. In plain language, it means this: the people at the bottom owed more than they could pay, and the money they were paying it with was worth less every year. They were running on a treadmill that was accelerating, and the treadmill was owned by someone else. The Roman philosopher Seneca wrote in the 1st century AD, quote, "Omnia aliena sunt tempus tantum nostrum est." Everything is borrowed. Only time is truly ours. He meant it philosophically. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries, it had become literally true for millions of Roman citizens. Everything they had was borrowed: their land, their tools, their seed grain, and the interest was killing them quietly, legally, systematically. Rome did not fall on one dramatic day. There was no single moment where the lights went out across the empire. What actually happened was a slow withdrawal. Provinces that once thrived began contracting. Trade routes that once hummed with activity went quiet. Cities that once grew began shrinking. The great Roman road system, the finest infrastructure the ancient world had ever seen, began to crack and decay not because nobody cared, but because the financial system that paid for its maintenance had been quietly looted for generations. And then when the Visigoths came, when Attila came, when the final pressure arrived from outside, the empire had already been hollowed out from within. The walls were still standing. The legions were still marching. But the foundation had been eaten away by 200 years of private extraction, monetary manipulation, and institutionalized debt. The barbarians did not conquer a strong empire, they walked into a shell. Now here is the moment this video has been building toward, because everything you have just heard about Rome is not a history lesson. It is a pattern recognition exercise. The Publicani collected taxes up front and lent money to those who could not pay. Today, the collection agencies that buy consumer debt for pennies on the dollar and then charge full interest are operating on identical logic. Private profit from public financial obligation. Rome debased its silver coins by reducing precious metal content while keeping the face value the same. Today, the process is called inflation. The face value of your dollar stays the same. The purchasing power, what it actually buys, decreases every single year. Your money says $100. The market says it is worth less than it was last year, and the year before, and the year before that. Rome solved short-term budget pressure by creating long-term structural weakness. Today, the United States national debt has passed $34 trillion. It is not a crisis because it is large. It is a pattern because of why it exists. Short-term political needs funded by long-term obligations that ordinary taxpayers will spend decades repaying with money that is worth less every year they repay it. And the final parallel, the most uncomfortable one, Rome's system worked for a very long time. The Publicani made enormous fortunes. The government got its cash. The coins kept circulating. For generations, the system appeared to function. It was only when you pulled back and looked at the full arc, 200, 300 years, that you could see it was consuming itself. Quietly, legally, efficiently. We are not at the end of that arc today, but we are somewhere on it. And the question that Rome never managed to answer: how do you reform a system when the people profiting from it are also the people responsible for reforming it, is the same question sitting unanswered at the center of modern financial policy right now. An empire does not always fall when it loses wars. Sometimes it falls when it turns collection into exploitation. When it solves today's crisis by weakening tomorrow's trust. When ordinary people stop believing the system is working for them and they are right. Rome built the greatest civilization the ancient world had ever seen. Aqueducts, roads, legal systems, architecture that still stands 2,000 years later. And it lost all of it, not to an enemy it could see, but to a financial structure it could not bring itself to change. The vault has been open this whole time. The question is whether you were ever meant to see inside it.